Hello, my dear friends. I hope you're all doing very well. We survived the hurricane and we're back at learning Rambam. Everything is going well. I hope you're also doing very well. Today we're going to beginning to study the 7th chapter in the set of laws of Tefillin, Mezuzah, and now comes the next part, which is the laws of a Torah Scroll, the Sefer Torah, which literally means the book of the Torah, the Torah Scroll. And the Rambam is going to be discussing over the next couple chapters the laws in regards to a Torah scroll. And he begins off by telling us that every single person, actually, every Jew has a commandment to write a Torah scroll for themselves. It's actually a very interesting law. Where it says in the words in the Torah, it says in Deuteronomy, it says that you shall now write down this song for yourselves in regarding to the Torah, that every person should write the entire Torah for themselves. Now, how does that work? So he says first, so if a person is actually able to write it on their own, that's a very good thing. Even if they got a Torah scroll or from their parents, grandparents, still they should write it on their own. But if a person is not able to write the entire Torah on their own, what should they do? Well, then there's two things. First of all, if a person can pay someone to write a Torah for them, that's a very positive thing. And also, if a person even checks and edits and fixes up even one letter in the Torah scroll, since every single letter is imperative to have a kosher scroll, it's as if he wrote the entire Torah, because he made this scroll now to be fit for use. So that's another way. Now, that's regard to every regular person. A king, a Jewish king, actually has a mitzvah, as a commandment, that they should write an extra Torah for themselves. They should actually have 2 scrolls. So we have one, just as every other Jew, a regular, and then one more, an extra one, because he's a king. Because a king always needs to have very strong fear of heaven, so therefore he needs to have an extra scroll, and this scroll is going to always be with him. His first scroll he'll put away in the storage, he'll have it somewhere on this side, but his other scroll, this he will always carry around with him. When he goes to war, when he goes into court, when he goes to eat, wherever he goes, he always is going to have the Torah scroll with him. So as it says in the verse, that it shall be with him and he shall read it all the days of his life. If he didn't have a scroll from before he became the king, so then he actually has to write 2. One as the regular scroll and one as the extra one for the king. And obviously when he goes to the bathroom or to sleep and so on, doesn't need to have the scroll with him, but any other time he needs it. But every regular person, the idea of having the Torah, writing a Torah scroll for themselves is a very important commandment. Now today, this mitzvah is not, we don't, practically speaking, we don't write, every person doesn't go to write a Torah. It's a very positive thing if someone is able to do that, but because it's not within the means of everyone to be able to do that, so by having Torah books, it is one of the ways of performing this mitzvah, this commandment, by having many Torah books in our house. Because the idea of having a Torah scroll is to be able to have the book of the Torah and be able to study from it. So, if we have Torah books, just like that, many Torah books in your house, reach out to me, I'll tell you which ones to get. And by having these Torah books in our house, this is going to fill our house with godliness, and we'll always be able to read God's wisdom, learn about Judaism, learn the ethics of what it is all about, and know what to do. So, that's in general. Now, let's get involved a little bit into the details of actually how to write a Torah. So if there is a mitzvah that we have to write a Torah, how do we do this? So first of all, the Rambam begins off by saying that whenever we write a Torah, it always has to be on a ruled parchment. In other words, it has to be on the right type of parchment, a specific type of parchment, and it has to be from one type, the entire Torah. You can't mix different types of parchments. And before you write, you actually have to make like a ruled lines across the space where it's going to be written on, that it should all be straight and beautiful, because the Torah has to be extra special and beautiful. This is the book from God. I mean, this is the Torah, God's wisdom. And it should be very beautiful writing, and you should have exact space between, a hair's breadth between every letter, and between the words there should be a little bit of a space of like the size of a small letter between every word. And it's actually quite specific how it should be written. And there should be 30 letters on every column. So in other words, the Torah is written in columns. I think it's 3 columns to a page, and every column has 30 letters on every line, and it shouldn't be the columns shouldn't be too long or too short, so that if it's too long, you'll get mixed up in where in the tall column you're looking at. If it's too short, it's just going to look like a little note. It's not going to look so nice. So it's very, very specific the way it's supposed to be. Now, between every Torah portion, we have a little bit of a space between every passage, between every chapter, and there is various ways. Sometimes it is a closed paragraph. So in other words, if you have a paragraph that finishes in the beginning of the line, so you'll have a space of 9 letters and then continue at the end of the line. Sometimes it's going to be just open all the way and we start from the beginning of a new line. So it depends, and we're actually going to be discussing this more at length a little bit later. But over here, he's just going over the general laws of it, and he says that because we want it to be a column, so therefore you shouldn't have letters sticking out of the column. That doesn't really look nice. So if you have a long word, with most of the word is going to be sticking out of the column, so that doesn't, you should just leave it empty, that extra space, if you have a few extra spaces, and then go begin a new line so that it should be a complete column. So to also, if you have a short word of 2 letters, you shouldn't stick it at the end of the line where it's sticking out, and then it's just hanging on its own, but rather begin it from the new line. So every portion, as we said, there's various paragraphs and so on, how the Torah is set up. Now, there are 5 books of Moses. So once you finish the first book, the book of Bereshit, of Genesis, now it comes to the end. So there is going to be a space before we start the next book, the book of Shemot, the book of Exodus. We actually leave a space of 4 lines. So there's a space of 4 lines, and then on the 5th line, we start writing the next book. And that's how it's going to work for all the books. And when we come to the end of the Torah, so we want it that it should be completed at the end of a full column, and the last line should finish in middle of the line. So it shouldn't be a complete column all the way till the end. We should set it up with the spacing of the letters that it should be enough that it should go to the end of the column and then a half a line in the middle, that the words Le'enei Kol Yisrael, which are the last words of the Torah, in front of the eyes of all the Jewish people, which talks about what Moses did, the greatness of Moses, should be in the middle of the line. And there are actually certain letters within the Torah which are actually larger or smaller than the regular font. So if you're writing, the scribe who is writing it is writing it in font size 16, let's say, it's around about that size. So then there are actually, in certain spaces, certain parts across the Torah, where there are letters that are a little bit larger or a little bit smaller. For instance, I'm going to just give you 2 instances where we have this. In the beginning of the book of Vayikra, the book of Leviticus, over there, the word Vayikra, the first word of that book, the Aleph, the last letter of that word, Vayikra, with an Aleph at the end, that Aleph is a miniature Aleph. It's a small one. For instance, the word the Shema, in the verse of Shema, it says Shema Yisrael, Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one. In the word one, Hashem Echad, the Dalid, Echad, the dalet of the last word of Echad, the last letter of Echad, is a large dalet. So there are certain places where there are bigger, smaller. So we have to be careful to write it the way it's supposed to be. And so there are certain letters that have little crowns on top of them. So we should make sure that it should all be perfectly and most beautiful. But the Rambam says that if a person didn't do all these details and he didn't make it as beautiful and special as we spoke over here, how it was being the tradition of the way it's supposed to be written, it's okay. The Torah is going to be kosher as long as he didn't actually change any letters, he didn't miss out any letters, so then the Torah would be okay. And it's a very interesting thing that there's actually a tradition that on every column there should actually be between 48 to 60 lines. So somewhere in between that number. And between every paragraph there should be 9 letters. And in the song of when the Jewish people crossed the Sea of Reeds, when they went out of Egypt, there was a special song that the Jewish people sang. It's called Az Yashir. Could be you've heard of it. That song is actually written in an interesting way. It's not written just regularly. It's because it's a song, so it's written in a special way where you have every line is split up into parts. So you have a few words and then a space and then 3 words and then a space. And then, so you have, it's split, it's written in like a form of a song. So it looks different than the rest of the column. So there are specific words, a specific way that column is supposed to be written. And it's important to follow all these details so that the Torah should be complete. Now, if a person did mess up on the Torah writing and he actually missed out a letter, or there are certain words that there are few ways to write them. There is a way to write it in a short form without the vowels. There are certain letters in the Hebrew language that are vowel letters. So you can write a word with the vowel, or you can write the word without the vowel. So there are specific ways every word is supposed to be written in the Torah. And there's a tradition of exactly which words are supposed to be written with their vowels, which ones without their vowels. So if a person mixed that up, so it's still the 5 books of Moses, it's still the Torah, but it's not a Torah scroll per se, which has all the holiness of a Torah scroll. But it's rather just like any other Chumash, as it's called. The Chumash, which is the book of the Torah that we study, but it doesn't have the holiness of a Torah scroll. And if a person has a Torah scroll which is not fit for use, so in other words, if it's a Torah scroll which is not correct, so a person should either fix it or he should intome it. In other words, so if it's just like another Chumash, in other words, the words are correct, just they're not correct for use for a Torah scroll, so then it's fine. But if it's a Torah which is not correct and now is not befitting to be used even as a Chumash, so then we should intome it, and either if it's fixable, then we should fix it. But if not, then it's actually buried. And as long as and if it's possible to fix, then definitely it should be fixed. And it depends. Certain circumstances it can be fixed. Certain circumstances it cannot be fixed, and it depends on the circumstance. And then we will be able to see if we're able to fix it. And we're actually, technically, if a person wants to write the 5 books of Moses, each one in their own scroll, you're able to do that. But it would not have the holiness of a Torah scroll. But we shouldn't just write one portion of the Torah in its own scroll, but rather an entire book should be in its own scroll. And for children to, unless it's for children who are learning and they're going to be learning the whole Torah, and now you just want to print out, so to speak, not print out. Print out, you can print out whatever you want. But if you're going to be writing a Torah, you can write one portion and the child will learn it, and then another portion, the child will learn it, and so on. Now you're able, technically, the Rambam says, to include in the Torah not just the 5 books of Moses, but also the prophets and the scriptures, and connect them into one single scroll. Now, it's going to be a special scroll to be used, but again, it would not be a Torah scroll. The Torah scroll is only the 5 books of Moses. It's written in this specific way, as we have said. But technically, a person can add also the prophets and the scriptures and the entire Tanakh, essentially, to be in this scroll. And again, if you're writing it, that has to be on a ruled paper, and as we know, there are the prophets: Joshua, Judges, Samuel, Kings, Jeremiah, Ezekiel, Isaiah, 12 minor prophets, and then there are the book of scriptures. There is Ruth, Psalms, Job, Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the Songs of Songs, Lamentations, Daniel, Esther, Ezra, and Chronicles. So all of these can all be connected into one. But again, it will be a special book to use, but it's not going to be a Torah scroll. So that's the general gist of how the laws of the writing of the Torah work. Very fascinating, and we're going to continue reading about it tomorrow, God willing. And we will see you. Have a very good night in the meantime.